Welcome back. Today we're digging into a really interesting geopolitical analysis. It draws a sharp line between the conflict risks around Taiwan versus the South China Sea disputes.
Mm-hmm.
And the core argument is pretty clear. Taiwan is China's absolute red line, a matter of national integrity. The South China Sea? That's framed more as strategic competition, economic plays.
Yeah, and that distinction, the existential versus the strategic, that's really the strong foundation of the piece. It gives you that immediate clarity.
Right.
But, when you're dealing with stakes as high, especially Taiwan, the risk assessment itself needs to be, well, absolutely airtight.
I agree. And the author really hammers home the point about Taiwan being non-negotiable for the CCP. They state flat out, a formal declaration of independence means war, 100% certainty.
And that phrase, 100% certainty, that's where we want to focus our first piece of feedback. Look, the analysis is spot on, identifying Taiwan independence as China's red line, absolutely.
Okay.
But asserting 100% certainty of war, it needs a bit more balance. It needs to factor in those critical variables like, U.S. strategic ambiguity, the actual state of deterrence.
I see the issue there analytically. Making it sound absolutely certain is dramatic. Sure, maybe it emphasizes the danger, but does it risk oversimplifying things?
It does, I think. And the danger is incredibly high, no doubt. But the weakness here is that framing it as is automatic, 100% certainty, just based on Taiwan's declaration, it kind of glosses over the complex dance happening.
The interplay.
Exactly. The interplay between Beijing's political needs, Taipei's actions, and, crucially, Washington's potential military and economic responses. All these things shift the actual probability, and maybe even more importantly, the potential scope of a conflict. Saying 100% certainty sort of stops the analysis of deterrence right there.
So the idea of inevitability kind of crowds out the complex strategic calculus that Xi Jinping and the leadership actually face?
Precisely. So the suggestion here is to really strengthen that risk assessment. You need to weave the concept of deterrent failure into the analysis.
Okay.
Move the discussion beyond just a simple yes-no war-no-war binary and into a more nuanced risk calculation. Yes, war might become politically unavoidable for the CCP if independence is declared, given their whole narrative.
Right, the mandate.
The historical mandate, yeah. But the actual military outcome? That's far from certain.
That's a really interesting angle. It shifts the focus from just predicting the decision to fight to analyzing how they'd manage the enormous risks of that fight. The costs of actually failing?
Absolutely. We need to explore those costs. So, for concrete examples, you could add a section exploring what are the consequences for China if a declaration of independence is met with, say, an overwhelming and sustained U.S. military response.
Mm-hmm.
That's maybe not certain, but it's plausible, right? It forces Beijing to think beyond just the political win of starting an invasion.
Yeah.
And maybe even more critical, how does the CCP leadership weigh the huge domestic political risk of not acting after a declaration against the, frankly, regime-threatening economic and strategic risk of losing a drawn-out war or facing, crippling sanctions and blockades?
Focusing on that internal political calculus, survival versus the external risk of military failure, that definitely adds layers of sophistication. It keeps the stakes high but grounds it in real strategic trade-offs.
It makes the whole prediction much more robust, much more defensible.
Okay, good point. Now let's shift gears a bit to the South China Sea. The analysis does a good job framing this as, strategic competition, manageable salami slicing, definitely not the same kind of red line as Taiwan.
Right.
But there's a section in there that felt like it disrupted that flow a bit.
You're probably thinking about the part discussing the 2016 International Tribunal ruling, the one the Philippines won and China basically ignored?
Exactly that. And then it goes on to compare China's actions to how the US and UK handled the Diego Garcia ruling, arguing that, great powers often disregard international law when it's inconvenient.
Mm-hmm. I know this section.
And reading it, I felt like we suddenly veered off track, away from assessing the actual military risk in the SCS and into more of a historical critique of how international law works or doesn't work.
That's the core structural issue we identified. That discussion about the tribunal ruling, it really interrupts the main analytical thread, which is focused on the likelihood of war in the South China Sea.
Okay,
The piece is building a case that the SCS risk is relatively low, manageable. And then suddenly you have this lengthy detour into violations of international law, which kind of inadvertently raises the moral stakes, maybe? It muddies the water?
But hold on, isn't providing that legal context, that background on China's behavior as a rising power, isn't that helpful for the reader? For giving that holistic picture?
It's useful context in a general sense, perhaps. But is it useful for this specific argument? I'd argue, not really.
Okay.
The weakness is that this segment on international law violations ends up feeling like an academic tangent. It pulls focus from the main thesis that the SCS is about salami slicing. It's manageable. It's not heading towards a major war.
Right.
When you jump from talking about, say, Coast Guard patrols and fishing fleets to the hypocrisy of great powers regarding UNCLOS clause, the reader loses the thread on the core argument about conflict probability.
So the key is ruthless focus. Keep the lens tightly on the military risk assessment, which the author argues is actually quite low for the SCS.
Exactly. So the suggestion is fundamentally structural. You either need to remove that historical and legal detour completely, or, if you feel it's essential, restructure the piece significantly. Maybe put it in a separate section, clearly marked as discussing China's approach to international norms, distinct from the direct military risk assessment.
Restructuring seems like the path. Keep the narrative flow smooth.
Yeah, you want it to flow seamlessly from, say, China's interest there to the methods they use, the low-escalation methods.
Got it.
So, for concrete examples, you could transition directly from discussing China's interest in freedom of navigation, which, as the piece rightly points out, is actually a shared interest with the U.S. because of trade.
Right, huge trade volume.
Straight into the primary tools China uses to assert control: artificial islands, maritime militia, economic pressure on neighbors. Keep the focus there. If you absolutely must include the legal comparison, maybe it becomes a footnote or part of a different higher-level discussion somewhere else. But it shouldn't break the flow of the risk assessment itself.
Excellent point on maintaining that narrative spine. Okay, now let's talk about what might be the biggest opportunity here to really deepen the analysis.
Yes.
The piece does a great job looking at Taiwan and the South China Sea individually, treats them as distinct problems. But it kind of stops there. It doesn't really connect the dots between them strategically.
And that's our third key point. To really maximize the analytical depth, the material needs to explore that strategic relationship. How does China's buildup in the South China Sea, all that infrastructure, how does that actually impact a potential Taiwan military scenario?
Right now, it feels like Taiwan is the sovereignty issue over here, and the South China Sea is about resources and strategy over there. Two separate theaters almost.
And treating them in isolation like that, that's the weakness. It ignores how all those military assets China's been installing in the SCS, the airfields, the ports, the radar systems. The piece mentions how they could fundamentally change the whole strategic picture during a Taiwan conflict. These aren't just isolated projects. They're integrated parts of China's bigger plan for controlling the first island chain.
So the suggestion is to build that strategic bridge, create that connective tissue between the two zones.
Yes, exactly. Introduce that link. Show how the incremental gains, the military buildup in the SCS, feeds into China's broader operational goals regarding Taiwan.
Okay.
You need to demonstrate how controlling the SCS, having those forward-basing capabilities, could enable a Taiwan invasion scenario, or at least significantly complicate the defense. The SCS isn't just about fish or oil claims anymore. It's about controlling the southern flank of any potential Taiwan operation.
I see now. That really elevates the significance of the salami slicing we talked about. It's not just about local dominance down south.
No.
It's about building the support infrastructure, the staging ground, for the main event, potentially.
Precisely. So, concrete examples. You could specifically explain how those SCS-based assets, the islands, the bases, could be used to try and deny U.S. naval access to critical sea lanes during a Taiwan crisis.
Right.
How do those advanced radar installations help secure China's own logistics routes needed for an amphibious assault? And how could those islands act as forward staging areas for aircraft or ships trying to isolate Taiwan from the south or west?
Wow. Okay. That really reframes things. It turns the SCS buildup into potentially a major pre-positioning effort for a Taiwan contingency. It effectively widens the potential battlefield forcing the U.S. and allies to think about a much larger operational area.
It makes the analysis feel truly complete, truly strategic. It shifts from being two separate regional risk reports into one comprehensive look at China's integrated strategy across that whole critical maritime space.
That really ties it all together. Okay, let's wrap this up. This was already a very strong piece of analysis, especially with that foundational distinction between the two flashpoints.
Absolutely. So we focused on three main areas to enhance its impact. First, adding more nuance to the Taiwan risk assessment, moving beyond 100% certainty to really integrate U.S. deterrence, and critically, the catastrophic political risk for Beijing if an invasion fails.
Right, balancing the certainty with the complexity of deterrence and failure. Second, we talked about restructuring the South China Sea section, either removing or clearly recontextualizing that legal digression about the tribunal ruling.
Yeah, keeping the flow laser-focused on the core argument about the lower probability of actual large-scale military conflict there, maintaining that narrative thread.
Exactly.
And finally, the big one, forging that strategic link, showing how the military and infrastructure buildup in the South China Sea isn't separate, but directly relevant to and potentially enables a Taiwan contingency, how it secures operational space and denial capabilities.
These are all really actionable points designed to take what's already good analysis and make it even more robust, more insightful.
We really encourage you to take these suggestions, refine the material, and please do submit the revised work back to us. We'd be very interested to see it.